US President Trump has delivered exactly what he promised in his campaign, launching a trade war. Trump has announced sweeping new tariffs on imports from Mexico, Canada, and China that has triggered sharp reactions from global leaders in financial markets. The tariffs, which Trump says are aimed at protecting American workers and industries.
Picture this. One day, you're going about your normal routine, buying groceries, paying bills, thinking trade and business are steady, and the next day, the rules change overnight. That's what happened when the US abruptly ended trade talks with Canada. Months of discussions, hope, and uncertainty all vanished in a single announcement. No deal. Suddenly, Canadians were left wondering what this meant for their jobs, their wallets, and their future. This isn't just about steel or aluminum tariffs, or even that extra few dollars on your morning coffee. It's about families feeling the squeeze, businesses facing unexpected costs, and a country realizing how much it relies on its powerful neighbor. The stakes are real, and the effects are already showing. In this story, we'll break down what happened, why Canada's position became so fragile, and how everyday Canadians are already seeing the impact. We'll explore the tough choices leaders face, the immediate consequences for families and industries, and why the next moves in trade negotiations could change everything.
Canada post-strike obviously means mails and parcels aren't being processed or delivered, and that is affecting Canadian citizens, residents, and businesses nationwide.
By the end, you'll see not just the numbers, but the real-life effects of this high-stakes showdown. A door slams shut. The Americans came to the table hopeful. They believed there was room to negotiate a bigger deal, something far beyond a simple revision of CUSMA. Their reasoning wasn't unfounded. Our economies are deeply connected. Trade, energy, automobiles, nuclear defense, so many areas link the two nations. There was a genuine belief that this relationship could grow into a more extensive, strategic agreement. But reality had other plans. The U.S. ambassador made it official. Talks were over. No more negotiation, no more back and forth, and certainly no deal with Canada. For Ottawa, it was a jolt. Months of anticipation and speculation ended with a blunt, unmistakable announcement. Ordinary Canadians felt it too, a mixture of shock and frustration. Many had sensed it coming, a quiet awareness that the U.S. might pull back, but the final confirmation left no doubt. For Washington, this was routine, another move in the America First strategy. It showed just how fragile Canada's position had become. The truth was simple. Washington walked away, and when Donald Trump drew a line, he never stepped back. This decision didn't come out of nowhere. For months, Canadians had been told that negotiations were ongoing, that progress was being made, and that a deal was possible. Yet the reality was starkly different. The U.S. had already imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security risks and border security concerns. Ottawa attempted to frame this as the start of serious negotiations, but the numbers didn't lie. A 35% tariff remained a 35% tariff, no matter how much discussion took place.
The President has signed an executive order raising Canada's tariff rate to 35%.
Canada understood that any compromise now would weaken its position in the full USMCA renegotiations coming next year. Essentially, the talks were a holding pattern, a waiting game orchestrated by the U.S. Canada had hoped to buy time, but the U.S. had no interest in compromise. The ambassador confirmed what insiders already knew: there would never be a deal. The effects were immediate. Manufacturers who relied on exports saw orders fall. Energy companies faced higher costs to move goods across the border. Ordinary Canadians started noticing the impact at the checkout line. This wasn't some abstract economic theory. It was real life, touching everyone in ways that mattered. From the U.S. perspective, the logic was brutally clear. "We support Canada," officials said. $200 billion a year in subsidies, millions of cars, lumber.
It's costing us $200 billion a year to support Canada.
But we don't need Canadian lumber. We have our own. Without the U.S., Canada wouldn't be able to function. They rely on us far more than we rely on them, 95% compared to 4%. The numbers speak for themselves. In the most extreme statements, some suggested Canada might as well be treated as the 51st state. No tariffs, no restrictions. It was a message of dominance, a reminder that Canada had very little leverage, and the consequences hit Canadians directly. Take something as simple as coffee. The beans were still the same, processed the same way, but prices jumped because American companies now had to pay a 50% tariff when importing them. That cost didn't disappear. It passed down the supply chain to Canadian consumers. Steel, aluminum, manufactured goods, the list was long. Tariffs didn't just squeeze companies, they squeezed families. And when households already struggled with mortgages, grocery bills, and rising energy costs, this wasn't just inconvenient. It was a daily reminder that international politics affected everyday life. Ottawa's response, however, seemed muted. Rather than taking immediate action, officials treated the situation academically, speaking of diversification and global trade opportunities. Meanwhile, the U.S. made it clear that they weren't negotiating. They were enforcing rules. The Canadian response. The difference in approach between the two nations was striking. In the U.S., leadership projected confidence and decisiveness. Letters were sent, deals were locked, and tariffs became contracts. About 200 letters were planned to secure agreements with countries ranging from Japan to the EU. It was organized, controlled, and firm. In Canada, leadership appeared reactive and defensive. Carney and his team scrambled to respond, pitching trade deals in Mexico, Europe, and Asia, fast-tracking energy projects, expanding ports, and trying to diversify supply chains. These were strategic moves, but they were rushed, reactive, and felt like catching up to a game the U.S. was already winning. The U.S. ambassador, Hora, did not shy away from criticizing Canadians themselves. He expressed disappointment, not just with Ottawa, but with Canadians more broadly, for their perceived lack of passion regarding the U.S.-Canada relationship. Many Canadians saw this as a lecture, a dismissal of their very real frustrations. Social media lit up with responses, with critics pointing out that the problems were caused by U.S. policy, not Canadian inaction. The economic impact was undeniable. Cross-border travel decreased. Canadians shopped less in U.S. stores. Alcohol and other imports declined. Canadian exports to the U.S. fell by billions. Canadians were voting with their wallets, showing they were aware of the economic squeeze. Ottawa's response focused on long-term strategies, diversification, new trade channels, and energy initiatives. But the contrast remained clear. The U.S. was proactive, Canada reactive. This situation highlighted a deeper truth. The no-deal moment was only the beginning. Next year's USMCA renegotiation would be far more consequential. Tariffs were the opening move, a warning shot signaling what was to come. Canada would not be able to walk away easily, and the stakes would be higher. If Ottawa struggled to navigate this relatively small clash, it raised serious questions about its ability to manage larger, more critical negotiations in the future. For ordinary Canadians, the impact was felt immediately. Families cut back on vacations, canceled extracurricular activities for their children, and adjusted daily routines to cope with rising costs. Inflation wasn't an abstract statistic. It was present in grocery stores, at the gas pump, and in homes across the country. Ottawa's response, blaming U.S. protectionism and talking about future diversification, felt inadequate. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued to move forward confidently, asserting dominance in trade negotiations and leaving Canada scrambling to react. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Trump projected decisiveness and strength. Carney appeared defensive and reactive. Industries continued to buckle under pressure. Jobs were affected. Exports shrank. Canadians were left asking why they were paying the price for decisions made thousands of miles away. Leadership, or the lack thereof, was the defining factor. Strong leadership commands respect. Weak leadership reacts, blames others, and struggles under pressure. The ambassador's comments added to the tension. By expressing disappointment at Canadians' supposed lack of engagement, he sent a message that frustration and concern were misplaced. Many Canadians disagreed strongly. They pointed out that the problem wasn't their attitude, it was U.S. policy. The economic fallout backed their frustration. Canadian exports had already declined significantly. Travel and shopping patterns were changing. Canadians were showing, in measurable ways, that they were affected and aware of the consequences. Ottawa responded with talks of diversification, exploring alternative trade routes, energy projects, and new partnerships. But these measures, while necessary, underscored the urgency of the situation. They should have been started years ago. The U.S. still dominated trade, and Canada's efforts felt like scrambling to regain lost ground. The irony was that Canadians were being told to see this setback as an opportunity, a push to explore new markets. In reality, it felt more like a forced pivot under pressure rather than a strategic advantage. The no-deal announcement was a wake-up call. It was the end of one phase and the beginning of another, with Canada at a crossroads. How Ottawa responded in the coming months would define the country's ability to adapt, survive, and maintain credibility. Trump and the U.S. moved confidently ahead, while Canada's future depended on rapid, effective leadership and strategy. Everyday Canadians feel the pressure. The impact of the no-deal announcement wasn't abstract, it was tangible, felt in homes, workplaces, and stores across Canada. Families began adjusting to the new reality. Vacations were postponed, kids were pulled from extracurricular activities, and budgets were tightened. Everyday life had changed, and inflation was now visible in the simplest of purchases. Coffee that once cost $12 now hit $18 on the shelf. Steel, aluminum, and countless manufactured goods carried higher prices. Tariffs weren't just a political issue. They were a strain on households already juggling mortgages, grocery bills, and energy costs. For ordinary Canadians, the frustration was real. Ottawa's explanations, blaming U.S. protectionism or talking about long-term diversification, felt hollow in comparison to the immediate effects. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued to operate with confidence and control. Letters were sent to countries with firm deals, tariffs enforced as binding agreements, and strategic decisions were made without hesitation. The contrast was stark, a decisive, self-assured U.S. on one side and a reactive, scrambling Canada on the other. It was becoming increasingly clear that the no-deal moment was just the beginning. Canadians were experiencing the immediate fallout, but the looming USMCA renegotiation next year was the real challenge. Tariffs had been an opening move, a test of strength and resolve. When the bigger negotiations arrived, the stakes would be far higher, and Canada would not have the luxury of walking away. If Ottawa couldn't handle this relatively small clash, it raised serious questions about its ability to manage negotiations with tenfold higher stakes. The frustration was evident not only in households but in business metrics as well. Cross-border travel was down, fewer Canadians were shopping in U.S. stores, and alcohol sales from American brands had dipped. Canadian exports to the U.S. had already fallen by billions. Canadians were voting with their wallets, making it clear they understood the consequences of the no-deal outcome. Yet Ottawa's solutions, diversification, new supply chains, energy projects, and alternative trade agreements, though necessary, highlighted how much ground Canada had lost. Carney and his team were moving quickly, trying to patch gaps and build new channels. They were pushing trade deals in Mexico, fast-tracking liquefied natural gas projects, expanding port capacity in Montreal, and opening channels with Europe and Asia. These were significant steps, but they were rushed.
Carney met with the Prime Ministers of the UK, Iceland, Spain, and Australia while here in London.
Diversification is always smart, but it takes time, years, not weeks, to implement effectively. Canada was running a marathon at a sprinter's pace, trying to catch up, while the U.S. continued to dictate the pace of trade and influence. Leadership under the spotlight. The moment highlighted a larger truth. Leadership matters. Strong leadership demands respect, sets rules, and ensures strategy is clear. Weak leadership reacts, blames others, and struggles to project confidence. The ambassador's comments had underscored this difference. Not only did he shut down negotiations, but he criticized Canadians themselves. He expressed disappointment, suggesting Canadians weren't passionate enough about the U.S.-Canada relationship. For many, it came across as dismissive, a lecture that ignored the very real frustrations Canadians were experiencing. Social media reflected this sentiment clearly. Critics argued that the problem wasn't Canadians, they were reacting to U.S. policies that created the difficulties in the first place. One user bluntly said, "You can't kick the dog and then blame it for growling." The economic fallout supported this view. Exports were falling, cross-border shopping was down, and Americans were being selective about Canadian products. Canadians were making their dissatisfaction clear in numbers and in choices. Yet Ottawa continued to talk about mitigation strategies. Diversification and new trade partnerships were emphasized as solutions. But the truth was that the U.S. still dominated the relationship. Attempts to pivot felt reactive, necessary, but insufficient to restore balance. Many Canadians felt trapped. They were told to see this as an opportunity, but it was really a forced adjustment under pressure, not a strategic advantage. The broader context made the stakes even higher. The real USMCA renegotiations were on the horizon, with far more significant consequences than these preliminary tariffs. Tariffs were only the opening gambit. When the talks begin next year, Canada would face higher stakes and far fewer options. If Ottawa could not handle this smaller dispute, what hope would there be for more critical negotiations? The lessons were clear. Leadership, credibility, and decisive action matter. The U.S. displayed all three. Canada, scrambling, reacting, and searching for solutions at the last minute, had yet to demonstrate the same capacity. The next months would be telling. Ottawa could either adapt and regain control or continue under pressure, risking deeper economic and political setbacks. The no-deal announcement also exposed a structural reality. Canada's economy relies heavily on the U.S. exports, trade, and investment flow overwhelmingly south, making the country vulnerable. Americans are confident, assertive, and willing to set rules that suit their interests. Canada, on the other hand, found itself reacting, trying to manage consequences rather than dictate terms. This imbalance isn't just about politics. It affects everyday Canadians, from families at the grocery store to manufacturers managing higher costs. Canadians were now witnessing the tangible difference between strong, decisive leadership and reactive governance. Trump projected power, set rules, and enforced them. Carney and Ottawa, despite good intentions, appeared unprepared and scrambling. Industries were under pressure, jobs were at risk, and ordinary Canadians bore the brunt.
Canada this morning, for the month of January, we lost just over 212,000 positions.
Families were cutting back. Canadians were feeling the strain of tariffs and economic uncertainty in ways that were personal, immediate, and unavoidable. The ambassador's tone had made it clear. The no-deal moment wasn't just about trade, it was a message to Canada. Without passion, decisiveness, and engagement, Canada could be sidelined in future negotiations, and the U.S. would continue to hold leverage. Canadians were left to ask difficult questions. How could the country regain balance? How could it negotiate from a position of strength? And perhaps most importantly, could Ottawa demonstrate the leadership needed to navigate the challenges ahead? The reality was clear. The U.S. had set the rules. Canadians were seeing the consequences firsthand. And Ottawa's attempts to pivot, diversification, alternative trade routes, energy projects, while necessary, were reactive and rushed. Canadians understood the stakes. The contrast between U.S. decisiveness and Canadian scrambling was obvious in daily life economic indicators and public sentiment. Preparing for the real battle. The no-deal moment was only a preview. The real challenge, the full USMCA renegotiation, was still ahead. Tariffs were just the opening move. When the full negotiations begin next year, the stakes will be exponentially higher. Canada would enter the talks with far less leverage if it failed to act decisively now. And if Carney and Ottawa couldn't manage this smaller clash effectively, what hope would there be for handling negotiations of much greater consequence? Every step Ottawa took in the coming months would be critical. Diversifying trade, expanding energy exports, and securing alternative routes were all necessary, but not sufficient. Canada needed to restore credibility, project strength, and negotiate from a position of power rather than reaction. Otherwise, the U.S. would continue to dominate, and ordinary Canadians would continue to pay the price. Leadership was the defining factor. Frustration and anger among Canadians were real, but those emotions alone would not solve the problem. Action, strategy, and credible leadership would. Ottawa's challenge was clear: adapt fast, regain control, and ensure that the country could withstand future pressure. Failure to do so would leave Canada vulnerable, and the gap between the U.S. and Canada would only widen. In the immediate term, Canadians felt the consequences in every corner of life. Inflation was visible in grocery stores. Travel and trade patterns were changing. Jobs were at risk. Families were adjusting their daily routines to cope. All of this was a reminder that politics has real, measurable effects on ordinary life. Canada was at a crossroads. The no-deal announcement marked the end of one phase and the start of another. Decisions made now would determine whether the country could adapt, survive, and regain credibility, or whether it would face deeper economic and political challenges. The U.S. moved forward confidently, setting the stage and holding the advantage. Canada, meanwhile, needed to find its footing, project strength, and negotiate strategically to avoid being permanently sidelined. This moment wasn't just about tariffs. It was about credibility, leadership, and Canada's ability to stand on its own feet when the U.S. decided to close the door. So far, the picture wasn't encouraging. Americans looked firm and in control. Canada looked pressured, scrambling, and reactive. Unless Ottawa changed course, the gap between the two countries would only grow, with serious consequences for Canadian families, businesses, and the broader economy. In the end, we can just say that the next months would be decisive. Ottawa's choices would determine whether Canada could navigate this crisis effectively or continue to struggle under the weight of an imbalanced relationship. Canadians understood the stakes. The U.S. had made its position clear, and the consequences of inaction were visible in everyday life. The test for Canada was simple, but critical: leadership, strategy, and credible action, or continued vulnerability. For Canadians watching, the contrast between U.S. decisiveness and Canadian scrambling was obvious. And the lesson was clear: this wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a test of leadership, credibility, and Canada's ability to navigate a world where the U.S. sets the rules. How Ottawa responded would shape the country's future for years to come. Hit like and share for more exciting stories.